We are so excited to have the legendary filmmakers Ken Burns and Lynn Novick here with us today for our National Leadership Summit. Both of you have collaborated over the years on many really important projects, including the war, Vietnam, and a personal favorite of mine, baseball. But today we're here to talk about your upcoming series, which the two of you co-directed with Sarah Botstein, called The U.S. and the Holocaust. This film is deeply important to ADL, and I gather to many of the people who are watching today. As the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, this really hit home for me. My grandfather came here as a refugee from Germany, and he had a book on his desk that I remember from being a kid. It was called While 6 Million Died. And it was a book that I learned about later in life, was about FDR and the role that he played, or didn't play, as it were, in saving Jews when he could have during the height of the war, when the U.S. government knew about what was happening and didn't do nearly enough, I think. So this really does, again, hit home for me. So Ken and Lynn, thank you so much for being with us today. Ken, I'd like to start with you. And if I might, I want to start with something I've heard you say. You described this project, this miniseries about the U.S. and the Holocaust, as one of the most important projects you and your team have ever worked on. So, again, considering the span of your work, why is that? Why did you think it was so important to make this film now?
Well, what I said was just slightly different, Jonathan, and thank you so much for inviting us. We're so honored to be with you in conversation. What I said is I didn't believe I would ever work on a more important film than this. And I think
Mm.
that's the most important thing to understand. We've covered a range of topics central to American history, and this is one of them as well. We tend to think as the Holocaust is happening somewhere else, but it's an important story for Americans to know and understand our relationship to. And so we have labored the last several years trying to benefit from the most recent scholarship and finding new archives to try to tell this extraordinarily complicated story. And I think in an interesting way, by focusing it, by narrowing it through the lens of the U.S. and the Holocaust, it has a strange, almost paradoxical ability to see the larger event in a different light, or at least from a different perspective. And it helps both connect Americans to this perhaps nadir of human behavior to the larger events that were taking place, of course, in Europe.
Lynn, most Holocaust documentaries over the years have focused on uncovering what happened in Europe and the reasons why Hitler's Germany was so determined to pursue the annihilation of 6 million Jews across the continent and slaughter millions of others along the way. And the gas chambers, in the ovens, all of it. Now, they pursued that until the very end of the war, at times when it seemed irrational to do so. So many documentaries, many books, many studies have focused on that. Why did you and Ken think about focusing on the American response to the Holocaust instead?
Well, as Ken was saying, it was an opportunity to take a new look at a chapter in history that I think we feel can always be looked at again because it's so important and looms so large in the history of humanity, and that we as Americans have seen it at arm's length for the most part, something that happened over there. And, we really wanted to ask some questions. We didn't come into this with a great deal of understanding of all the details. We worked with great scholars to look at some really important questions. What did we know? When did we know it? What was the government's response, the population's response, the Jewish community's response? Why was it so hard to get here? Why didn't our government do more to let in more refugees? On the other hand, we did let in more than any other country. So we wanted to take a nuanced and deep look at our response to this catastrophic event, and in the hope that it would help us understand not just the Holocaust, as Ken was saying, which it certainly did, but also ourselves. Who are we? What drives us? What are our values as a society? How that has changed? And I think for us, it's the gap, or the sometimes chasm, between our stated values, what we hold dear and believe in, and why we are not able or don't live up to those values. I think that this is the story that we're always exploring, and this gave us an incredible opportunity to do that.
Well, it's interesting you put it that way, Lynn. I do think it's right that if I think across the body of your work, it does seem like by looking at the Civil War, or by looking at our national pastime, or by looking at the conflict in Vietnam, it helps us to better understand where we are today. I see that. But Ken, I wonder, is there something about this time now, this moment in American history, really in the history of the world, when you think
Yeah.
this story needed to be told? You know, and I,
Well,
and I think about
Jonathan,
that. Yeah.
there's no really now for us. We've been working on this for many, many years. And as we have found out, I think so interestingly that there hasn't been a film out of 40, I believe, that PBS has put on that hasn't in some ways resonated in the present moment. Now, people are fond of saying that history repeats itself. It never does. We also say we're condemned to repeat what we don't remember, which is lovely, but I don't think it's germane. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And, when
Hmm.
we finish a film, we lift up and see the way in which every film that we've made is rhyming in the present moment. I'm very
Hmm.
sorry to say that many of the themes that are engaged in this story are perpetual themes of human existence. Ecclesiastes said there's nothing new under the sun, which suggests that human behavior, human nature doesn't change. And if that's the case, then you're going to find in the United States as well as in Europe, anti-Semitism, you're going to find racism, you're going to find nativism and anti-immigrant sentiments. You're going to find people who, as Lynn say one thing and actually act out quite the opposite of that. And that this is very true today. And I think that while we can assure you that we spend all of our time, 100% of our time, focusing on the story that we're required to tell, we now, after having done this for several decades, know that no matter what the subject matter is, whether it's Brooklyn Bridge or the Civil War or baseball or jazz or the Vietnam War, we are going to be resonating in the present moment. And unfortunately, as I said, I'm sorry to say that so many of the themes, the darker themes that haunt the frames and the scenes of this film, are present with us today. I do not need to tell the ADL that. You
Right.
know what's going on. And so I hope that in a way, the past, history, can be a less fraught story that we can share and perhaps share with those who we might not agree with today, so that we can have a way to have a kind of common past, at which point we may be able to look with a little bit more dispassion at what's going on in our present moment.
Wow. Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I think, as you said at ADL, we know exactly what you're talking about. And that Twain quote about history of not repeating but rhyming, we think about that a lot. And, just last week, we issued our 2021 survey of anti-Semitic incidents, and we found that there were more acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence directed at the Jewish community in 2021 than at any point that we've seen in more than 40 years. So there seems to be something happening right now. I'd love to push maybe, Lynn, you a little bit on what Ken was saying. And again, these themes are sort of evergreen, but do you see parallels as you look at the world and look at America between what happened maybe in the 30s before the war and where we are today? Do you see some things? And I guess I should also ask, not just if there are specifics there, but maybe you could tell us a bit about also what you learned as a filmmaker in terms of how America changed in the aftermath of the Holocaust. What was different on the other side than before?
I'm glad you asked about the 30s because, this our story begins even before that. And to understand America's response to the Holocaust, we do have to look back to the years before that when Hitler came to power, and it was so difficult for anyone wanting to immigrate here because of quota restrictions that had been put in place in the 20s because of the
Hmm.
nativist anti-immigrant feeling Ken was talking about. And so the framing for this story is bigger than just the years in which the Holocaust took place. And we always want to understand how we got here, how that happened. We have to go way back. And I think that's true with our current moment. We have to go way back to understand the things that resonate for us. There's so many, it's hard to know where to start. And, the feeling of the questions about who's a real American. who belongs here, who should we
Mm.
welcome, who should we exclude, the sort of the movement, I would say, of white supremacist rhetoric from the fringe to the mainstream has been very alarming. And that you see that, in the 30s, we have home movie footage of, pro-Nazi rallies with American flags and swastikas. And so, there's a continuity here with lots of bumps along the way and paths not taken and paths taken. It's not linear and direct, but you see the echoes, as Ken was saying. And so, I think we're trying to show you what happened and have our audience make some of those connections more than us as filmmakers, really absolutely connect all the dots, but they're there.
Wow. So then let me turn with that, building up of that back to you, Ken. How do you think America changed in the aftermath of the Holocaust? What did you learn and find through putting this film together that you think is worth sharing today as we look at maybe some uncomfortable parallels?
Well, I wish I could report something that's rosy and optimistic, but as we look at our present moment, we realize that somehow the space between the Holocaust and now has been filled less with kind of positive responses, and there have been many and good things. Immigration laws were changed. There was immediately after the war, even when the worst horrors of the Holocaust were revealed in newspapers and horrific photographs and statistics that were just impossible to comprehend, Americans were still loath to let in more refugees, particularly Jewish refugees. And that took a lot of changes. The new immigration law in the mid-60s helped a little bit, but wasn't addressing the issue of refugees. And as Lynn says, we're in a time right now where a good deal of what was considered fringe behavior has now been permitted to be in the center stage. And that has, of course, helped to multiply that. Having said that, I think human beings were shocked by what they had seen in a series of events like the footage, like the Nuremberg trials, like Adolf Eichmann's trial, like movies, Judgment at Nuremberg, in which the footage was out there. My dad, when I was a little boy, made me watch that. Stuff we wouldn't let our kids at age whatever I was, 7 or 8, watch it, but he wanted me to know. He'd been in the United States Army, and he wanted me to know what the stakes were, and it got me. And I think in some ways, for at least I can't speak for Lynn or Sarah Botstein, but my connection to this story, as horrible as it is, sort of began there with a kind of real understanding that the games of war we were playing out in the backyard, fighting the Germans, had a much more serious and deep resonance. And I've spent, it's really, I think Lynn would agree this. We've spent many decades getting to the ability to tell this story.
Wow,
many
that's
other
remarkable.
films like World War II touch on it. Baseball touched on it in a way. The Roosevelts did, and what we found is that people are clouded. We've benefited from the most recent scholarship, and sometimes that scholarship is actually helping to set aside other scholarship that has helped create conventional wisdom on the part of people, where something is certain, like FDR is this type of person, and this happened because he didn't do this, or all these other kinds of sets of dominoes that didn't happen. And I think it's been important for us to sort of clear a lot of things up. It doesn't necessarily make them less. It doesn't make them happier, but it does help to put them in a kind of perspective in which you can understand. And as Lynn said, give our audience the chance to digest the information and come to their own conclusions.
Mm. Well, let me ask one sort of. Oh, go, Lynn, please.
I'm just going to quickly say that I think one of the things that we did see, was that anti-Semitism in America has taken on a different cast since the Holocaust. And so it's not monolithic, and the quotas at universities and neighborhoods and restrictions, and there was overt, mainstream anti-Semitism that was pervasive, and that really has shifted. So Jewish American, I also recognize there's a multiplicity of perspectives, there's a multiplicity of experiences, and so we just don't want to paint with too broad a brush, frankly.
Right. No,
You know,
and Lynn is
yeah,
exactly right. And the same goes to true with race, the question of race. There's been huge advancements, but you can't really tell that to George Floyd's family with too much confidence. And so I think
Mm.
just as the worshipers in Pittsburgh or all the other thousands of places that you've documented, it doesn't look like a lot of progress. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that they're not hotels that say no Hebrews here.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think this is really important points about the nuance of it and the complexity of it. We have moved so far, yet we still feel like we have such a long way to go. So I want to ask one final question. We don't have that much time left, but it strikes me as an organization that's very focused on changing hearts and minds through investing in anti-bias, anti-hate content in classrooms, that Ken and Lynn, you developed an incredible teaching tool that will, it just adds another really important contribution to our collective understanding of the complexity of the Holocaust. So beyond airing on PBS, do you have a broader outreach plan for the film? And how do you think schools or
Oh,
communities could use it?
Almost definitely, Jonathan. And that's the reason why we've spent our entire professional lives with public broadcasting, because most broadcast television is skywriting that disappears at the first breeze. And our
Mm.
films that are 30 years old live every day. Today is a school day in the United States, and our films are being shown in hundreds of classrooms, whether it's the Civil War or Lewis and Clark or World War II or Vietnam or jazz or even baseball. Some school districts have told post Civil War U.S. history through the baseball series. So we're very thrilled at the possibilities here. PBS reaches every classroom in the United States, and the Holocaust Museum, which we've produced the film in cooperation with in Washington, D.C., the National Memorial Holocaust Museum, their staff is invaluable in pointing us in the direction of photographs and scholars and helped us vet some of the more contentious aspects of this. They have robust educational outreach. So we're looking forward to being able to join the conversation about this, where we're really on a cusp here between kind of tribal and civilized impulses. And paradoxically, the Jews brought to the rest of the world the notion of fair play and the golden rule and democracy and all of these kinds of ideas. And the tribal response is to go against it. And all you have
Yeah.
to do is ask someone in Ukraine what you mean by that.
Hmm. Wow. Well, look, that's a great way to end. I think it's a fascinating film, and I just so appreciate this thoughtful conversation here today. Thank you again, Ken and Lynn, for joining us, and thank you for the body of your work is extraordinary, and I think this film, as you said at the start of this conversation, Ken, I'm so glad you made it because its importance, I think, is so profound. So once again, the name of the film is The U.S. and the Holocaust, and it will be premiering on September 18th on PBS. And as a follow-up to today's discussion, ADL will be sharing more information about the film, including ways that you, members of our leadership, can help promote this important new film in your community. So there's more to come on that. Thank you again, Ken and Lynn, so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Jonathan.
thank you so much for having us.